Along with long-term émigrés, he meets other deserters there from the Russian officer corps. Igor Novosiltsev is already working for German propaganda. He recalls his first encounters with Vlasov. In our first talks, Vlasov said to me that we had to have an alternative. We had to offer the Russian people a clear plan for our movement. Ultimately, every person had to know what he was fighting for. In this connection, Vlasov was against the ideas of the Nazis. They were completely unsuitable for the Russian people. After all, there were many ethnic minorities living there. Therefore, it wasn't possible for us to adopt Hitler's ideology. The Wehrmacht propaganda unit tries to back up Vlasov in style. Hitler and his general staff are to be induced with numerous memoranda and petitions to permit the founding of the Russian Liberation Army. The head of the Wehrmacht Supreme Command, Field Marshal Wilhelm Keitel, rejects these attempts. In November, he declares he will absolutely not tolerate any further proposals of this sort. They wanted to do good, but they didn't have any power. They were so far in the background that nobody listened to them. They were in the opera, somewhere back in the chorus. And that's the worst part. They had ideas. They not only had visions, but quite tangible concepts how something could be done. They held discussions with Vlasov. That was permitted, but they weren't allowed to do anything. Then we thought that the chances of setting up a Russian Liberation Army would increase as Germany's military position worsened. In the summer of 1942, the Red Army stops the forward march of the German Wehrmacht at Stalingrad. After months of bitter fighting in the streets, the German Sixth Army is boxed in by the Soviets. At the end of 1942, it's clear that defeat is near. Meanwhile, at a meeting in December 1942, the commanders of the rear-occupied zones push for a reorientation of Eastern policy. One of the participants was former Lieutenant Hans von Herwarth. It concerned the treatment of the population in the occupied zones and the volunteers. The German officers taking part, and also the reasonable people from the East Ministry and parts of the SS, maintained that the population had to be treated decently, so they wouldn't be driven back into the arms of Stalin, and that the volunteers from the former Soviet army had to be treated the same as German soldiers. At the time, I contended the war could really only be won with the help of the Soviet peoples. But we had to transform it into a civil war. This was generally agreed to, even by the SS. The military's demand are grist to the mill for Vlasov's supporters in the Wehrmacht propaganda unit. In mid-January 1943, an officially sanctioned flyer proclaims the existence of a fictitious Russian Liberation Army and an anti-Stalinist government in opposition. In this so-called Smolensk proclamation, Vlasov promises the Russian people democratic rights and freedoms in a Russia liberated from Stalin. Millions of copies are dropped over the Soviet Union, in the German-occupied zone, and also behind Soviet lines. I read the Smolensk proclamation of the Russian Committee at the time. There were points in it I thoroughly supported. Freedom of opinion, agreed. Freedom of the press, agreed. We really didn't have any freedom of opinion. It was a farce with the Bolsheviks. You could agree with them but not disagree. The right to demonstrate did not exist. Just try to demonstrate against the Bolsheviks, that was forbidden. What kind of freedom is that? Vlasov was a traitor from the beginning, and he stayed one when he tried to cover it up with slogans. He was only trying to win more people to his cause. That's why he portrayed himself as defender of the fatherland. I was personally exhilarated by this proclamation. I thought now the time had finally come when the Russian people could free themselves from the hated dictatorship of Stalin and the yoke of the Communist Party. The predominantly positive reactions to the Smolensk proclamation have an effect in Berlin. Vlasov and his German supporters seem to have taken a large step closer to their aims. At this time, about 500,000 so-called Russian volunteers are being deployed under German command as partisans and helpers. They're given an insignia to wear on their uniforms. It identifies them as members of an army that officially doesn't exist, the ROA, Russkaya Osvoboditelnaya Armia, the Russian Liberation Army. Meanwhile, the planning center for a future authentic Russian Liberation Army is set up in Dabendorf, south of Berlin, the so-called East Propaganda Unit. Camouflaged as a propaganda installation, former members of the Red Army are to be trained there in their future role as officers in the Liberation Army. The camp in Dabendorf had a certain extraterritorial status. We were supposed to talk about the advantages of the Nazi regime, but nobody believed in it, neither the speaker nor the ones who were listening.
Встретился я с немцами, которые прекрасно говорили по-русски, были, значит, от немецкого командования в этой школе Дабендорфа, то
I lost my misgivings when I met Germans who spoke wonderful Russian, sent by the army leadership to Dabendorf. I saw that these Germans were sincerely trying to help the Russians and their movement.
Помочь этому движению, что даже, например, такие как
Some of them, for example, Strickfeld, had even passionately taken up Vlasov's cause.
Потому что они слишком были про Vlasova.
Nevertheless, after the end of basic training, the officer candidates come to a sobering realization.
В лагере Дамбендорфа убедились в том, что никакого власовского движения нет.
In Dabendorf, we came to understand that no Vlasov army actually existed. Everybody being trained there would only be assigned propaganda duties.
Это очень было больно открыть.
This realization was very painful, but it was a fact, and we had to come to terms with it. But every one of us believed the time would come when the Germans would have to arm us and consider us a fighting unit.
Получить вооружение и сформировать крупные воинские соединения.
Я лично считаю, что вот самое трагическое положение, которое было в 1943 году,
In this situation in 1943, I advised Vlasov to protest to Hitler and his entourage that they were using him and his name in effect to recruit Russians and defraud them. But a great deal of courage was required to do that. I assumed Vlasov would possess this moral courage. But he told me he didn't want to leave his supporters in the lurch. I think that was a big mistake. If he had acted differently, he would have become one of the heroes of Russian history.
Он вошел бы в историю русского народа тогда как герой.
Народ мой любимый, отчизна родная, я сын твой, я русский сердце.
In February and March of 1943, Vlasov is sent to the rear zones of the central and northern military groups. His mission? To prevent the German Vlasov propaganda from losing credibility with the population of the occupied territory. Viktor Bogomolov was one of his bodyguards on this trip.
С кем поговорит, постоит, так вот. Ну, а потом ропоток идет, ну, вроде мужик ничего, так, знаете.
Vlasov spoke briefly with many, and later they very quietly discussed their opinions.
А тот говорит, вроде ничего, вот такие вот.
Some said, yes, he seems to be a good man.
Вот разные такие вот суждения были.
Some said he can go to hell.
Он только по частям разъезжал.
Others commented, the best thing would be if he didn't exist at all. Afterwards, he gave speeches. He said, we're allied with the Germans, but we'll fight separately and we'll free Russia from the communists.
Сделаем Россию свободной. Вот такие вот речи говорил перед строем.
What was the reaction of those listening?
Все браво.
Most applauded and cheered.
Орут все. А он растет.
The masses supported him,
Массы поддерживает.
and Vlasov was visibly
Он
moved.
растет.
During one of his appearances, Vlasov commits a fatal error.
Это было после второй его поездки.
It was after the second trip to Gatchina, where you could already see the skyline of St. Petersburg. It was there he actually said he hoped that sometime he'd be able to invite the Germans as guests. Today he was their guest, and in the future he would be the host, issuing the invitation. When Field Marshal Keitel hears about this statement, he forbids Vlasov to make further public appearances and orders him to be taken to a prisoner of war camp. Vlasov's German supporters are able to prevent this order from being carried out. He is put under house arrest in this villa on the Kiebitzweg in the Berlin district of Dahlem.
It
was bad that from the beginning there was no official treaty between the German government and Vlasov as leader of the movement. In this treaty there should have been agreements regarding the aims, duties, and the future. Also, procedures could have been stipulated regarding Allied warfare and the deployment of the Liberation Army. Although Vlasov has fallen into disgrace with the military leadership, his name is still being used in propaganda, with or without his knowledge. Silver Stripe is the cover name for a campaign started in the spring of 1943 on the initiative of Reinhard Gehlen. Flyers and loudspeaker propaganda promise soldiers of the Red Army preferential treatment if they desert and join the Liberation Army, which is presumably under Vlasov's command.